Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is LawPod.
Welcome to LawPod. I am Lauren Dempster. I'm a lecturer in the School of Law at Queen's University Belfast, and I'm joined today by Dr Matthew Evans. This episode is the latest in our mini-series, which explores a recently published edited collection, Beyond Transitional Justice, Transformative Justice and the State of the Field or Non-Field, which is edited by Matthew, and it was published by Routledge earlier this year, so in 2022. So in this episode, we are joined by Matt to discuss his individual contribution to the collection, which is a chapter entitled Beyond Disciplines, Beyond Fields and Beyond Transitional Justice. So we have an earlier episode where Matt discusses the collection overall, so you can go back on our website and find that if you want to listen, if you haven't already. But today we're talking about Matt's individual chapter. So Matt, could you briefly introduce yourself for our listeners, and then I'll ask you a few questions about your chapter.
Hi, I'm Matthew Evans, as you've already said, and I am a senior lecturer in law, politics and sociology at the University of Sussex, and I'm also a visiting researcher in the Department of Political Studies at the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. And I wrote Chapter 4, Beyond Disciplines, Beyond Fields, Beyond Transitional Justice, in the collection that I edited, which is also called Beyond Transitional Justice. I'm excited to hear what questions you have about it.
I was delighted to see your chapter. My own research has always been very interdisciplinary, and the notion of transitional justice as a field or a discipline, or indeed how useful those terms are, or how much we should be sort of constrained by those ideas, is something that I've always been interested in. So I was delighted to see your chapter on this. Could you, I guess, sort of briefly tell us what your chapter's about, and then we can delve into it in a bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the chapter comes out of some thinking and some work that I've been doing over the last few years, where I've really been trying to engage with the idea of interdisciplinarity and what that means, and what the opportunities but also the limitations are of pursuing interdisciplinary research in universities primarily, and that really comes out of my own experience as somebody who has a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary background in terms of my studies and in terms of my current work. And especially out of a frustration with the disciplining tendencies, in a Foucauldian sense, the disciplining, governing tendencies of universities when it comes to defining work as being law, or being politics, or being sociology, or being international relations, or some other discipline, or even as being, say, transitional justice as opposed to human rights, or as opposed to transformative justice, a concept that I use in this piece and several others, in my view, as something that's parallel with but overlapping with transitional justice rather than within transitional justice. But this piece in particular is engaging with that question of what do disciplines and fields mean for transitional justice, and is there an advantage, and really positing that there is an advantage, to thinking and acting beyond disciplines and beyond fields, and there, by extension, clues in the title, beyond transitional justice, and seeking not to limit the scope of thoughts and also the scope of actions when it comes to responding to issues like conflict, like historic injustice, like authoritarian rule, like human rights abuses and so on. So what I do in the chapter is partly set out how other people have talked about transitional justice and defined it as a field, or maybe non-field, as Christine Bell, whose work I draw on heavily in this piece and in the collection as a whole, put it, and then seek to kind of identify what the issues, or what some of the issues might be with defining transitional justice in those ways, and then imagining and proposing ways of looking beyond those limitations, I suppose, which leads me to this notion of postdisciplinarity, which is something I've engaged with in some other publications over the last 2 or 3 years, which I guess I'll probably say a bit more about in a moment. But that's something that I then explore towards the end of the chapter as not necessarily a solution to all problems by any means, but as a notion that might be helpful for scholars and practitioners, might address some of the limitations of transitional justice as a field of practice and scholarship, and some of the limitations of academic disciplines in general, but maybe in particular of the 2 or 3 academic disciplines which have a particular hold on questions around justice in transition, law especially, but also, say, politics or political science, maybe a couple of other ones that have been particularly influential in shaping this field or defining this non-field as something vaguely coherent, which has its benefits in a sense. We can see what we're talking about when we talk about transitional justice. Maybe sometimes we might disagree, but there's something there. But there maybe are problems with that as well. And by drawing those borders and by defining things in these disciplinary ways, maybe something's left out. And perhaps postdisciplinarity is a way of including some of those things that are left out, moving beyond those boundaries. And I set out a few possible next steps quite tentatively in the very final part, in the conclusion of the chapter.
Thank you, Matt. I want to pick up on a couple of points from within that. I guess the point I would like to start with is, as you mentioned, the sort of the dominance of law in transitional justice. And obviously this is an idea that's been around for a long time. For instance, Kieran McAvoy explored it in his Beyond Legalism piece back in, I think, 2007. And it's something that Rachel and Colleen and I have been exploring in our own work. In your view, given that transitional justice is, as you've said, like this field that draws on all sorts of disciplines, why does law continue to dominate? And from your own research, like, what is the impact of that? Like, how does that shape transitional justice?
I think that's a good question. I think there are probably a number of ways that it continues to shape practice, and I think especially in the idea of when transitional justice is fairly narrowly defined, it tends to be in terms that are very much about the law or about quasi-legal methods. So justice understood in a very formal sense about courts issuing judgments, or somewhat less, not necessarily less legal, I suppose, but less embroiled in the criminal law than maybe things like truth commissions, which have a very formal structure typically, and have members who are not necessarily judges, but they kind of sit in a panel as commissioners, which is somewhat similar to a trial or a very formalized process like a government inquiry or a judicial review or something like this, where if it's not law in a very narrow sense, it's certainly legal. It looks quite legal, and lots of the people involved are likely to be lawyers. And I think some of the implications of that are about what kinds of things are viewed as possible and what kinds of things are viewed as important, and to some degree what words like justice are taken to mean, which in turn limits or defines, and to quote Oscar Wilde, to define is to limit what can be done, or what is thought to be possible. And I think the reasons probably go back to the origins of transitional justice, or at least what we tend to talk about as the origins of transitional justice in the sort of post-World War II era of war crimes trials, and then transitions to democracy in some Latin American countries throughout the sort of 1970s and 1980s, where criminal law and things like establishing democracy and the rule of law, understood in a fairly narrow, formalistic sense, were the dominant practices. They were the things that were viewed as important. The people who were involved were often lawyers and or organisations which have a strong overlap with law, like the UN. I mean, the UN even being created, somewhat legal entity, makes treaties, involves a lot of law. It creates international law. That this is part of it, which I then think leads to these issues that I already mentioned. This sort of definition of what do we mean by justice, and to give a slightly caricatured version of a lawyer's view, then maybe what we mean by justice is a judgment in a courtroom, or maybe what we mean by transition needs to be defined in legal terms about a constitution that legally guarantees a certain enumeration of rights and establishes the rule of law. And that's kind of neat, and it does something, but one might question whether that's everything, or whether that's enough, or whether that's the most important, or at least the most important understanding or issue for people most affected by a conflict or authoritarian rule, which leads to other conceptions, which I think sometimes are crowded out by this institutionalized, professionalized dominance of law. Not that law is the only discipline that has a key influence on transitional justice, but I think that's some of the reasons why it does, and some of the reasons why it might at least sometimes be a bad thing.
Thanks, Matt. I realise that these are hefty questions to ask you in the context of a relatively short podcast. The second sort of big point I want to pull out in relation to your chapter then is this notion of post-disciplinarity that you've already mentioned. So I guess, could you say a little bit about what it is? I mean, you've touched on already sort of why the notion appeals. I guess for the purposes of the podcast, I guess what would like post-disciplinarity look like in the context of transitional justice?
Yeah, so I think how I've defined post-disciplinarity, which draws heavily on Andrew Sayer, who's written about this going back 20 plus years, actually, and a few other scholars, but not that many, sort of engage with the concept or trying to define it. But how I've defined it really is about looking beyond disciplines and the tools that they provide and the assumptions they provide with a view to trying to address questions or issues of concern by using the most appropriate tool for that question, rather than by starting from a set of tools which can then be applied to some questions or some issues, but maybe not so much to other ones. So it's in terms of thinking about it, it's maybe flipping the direction by which you might approach something. So if you have a disciplinary toolkit, you maybe open that up and think, okay, I have these tools and I can use them for these sorts of things, and that's what I'll do. Whereas postdisciplinarity suggests that what we should do, at least some of the time, is the other way around. There's this issue, there's this problem, there's this idea. What tools do we need in order to understand that or address it? Now that's quite easy to say, it's maybe harder to do, and I don't think that we can completely escape disciplines, at least not under current circumstances. And this is partly why I put forward a notion of post-disciplinarity as opposed to suggesting moving back to pre-disciplinarity. It's something I talk about in a different piece in a little more detail. So there are those who argue that pre-disciplinarity is where disciplines hadn't really been established as we understand them now until maybe the late 19th century, the early 20th century. Little by little, things became more and more defined and siloed into departments in universities and these sorts of things. But before that, the idea of a clear distinction between science and philosophy, say, was not necessarily that big a deal. But also within what we might call the social sciences or the humanities, or both of those, there were a lot of crossovers and different ideas and techniques and theories were developed without regard for focusing only on economics or law or philosophy or politics. And lots of very influential scholars might have been said to be pre-disciplinary, whether that's Weber or Marx or various other people who are kind of part of the Western canon of social science and humanities scholars. But at the time, they weren't really sociologists or philosophers or economists, because those disciplines didn't really exist in that sense, and that arguably is for the good, because it allows shifting across different ideas and techniques and the development of new ones. But I say we can't really move to pre-disciplinarity, because that process of disciplining has happened. So it's after disciplines and beyond disciplines in the sense of post. And I think that in practice, it's about trying to, where it is possible to do so, trying to strive to be beyond those limitations of a discipline that you maybe have been placed in. And sometimes this is external. Certainly a thing that I find being based, say, in a law school at the moment, having never studied law as a sort of named degree beforehand, and not considering myself to be a lawyer. So what kind of thing do I do? It's maybe not law, or it's not only law, or it's not just law. And I set out a few kind of tentative ideas of how one might try to move beyond the constraints of disciplines, without suggesting that it's as easy as clicking your fingers and you're emancipated from the disciplinary chains, which to draw on, say, a sort of provocative work about postdisciplinarity there.
Thanks, Matt. I guess my final question then would be one. So I think this is relevant for your chapter and also the edited collection as a whole. So when we're thinking about scholarship that critically reflects on the nature of the field or the boundaries of the field, I guess I sometimes find myself wondering at what point that reflection stops being like useful and maybe approaches a sort of navel gazing, that actually stops us from moving forward. And I'd just be interested to hear your reflections on the value of this sort of critical reflective work. And is there a point at which it perhaps stops being useful for us as academics?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that I try in the chapter to link what could be seen as quite a theoretical and disconnected question about defining transitional justice, defining disciplines, to some more concrete ideas about, well, what is it that we do and how can we do it differently? And also how might that affect practice, which is, of course, shaped, whether directly or indirectly, by scholarship. So exactly where a line might be, I would not like to hazard a guess, I suppose. But whilst I am certainly engaged in a certain degree of academic autophagia here and in some of my other work, I don't think it's without use, if you like. And this is a concern that I've had in terms of sometimes the application of critical theory, and I've written about this as well, the danger of producing bullshit in Harry Frankfurt's terms of something that's dishonest without lying, and theory and discussions that aren't actually doing what they're meant to do. So if I say this is going to move forward the field and it's going to change how people practice things, I probably wouldn't make claims that grand, but is it though? Is it actually useful for that, or not? And I think something like postdisciplinarity, it's useful, and this kind of reflection is useful because as scholars, especially those of us who teach, we are shaping the field, in quotation marks, and that means shaping how scholars think about things, and it means shaping how practitioners, and including future practitioners who maybe are our current students, think about things and how they do things. And that then has an impact. So some of the problems I identify with disciplinarity, and particularly the dominance of law, that there's perhaps a certain way of thinking and therefore a certain set of tools that are applied in practice as well as in scholarship to transitional justice, which leave some things out. But reflect on that and reflect on the place of disciplines and disciplinary tools at least allows for the possibility of not doing that, I suppose. Even if you are a lawyer by profession, of being engaged with questions around what does law do and what doesn't it do, and what else could there be, which allows for thinking beyond those limitations. I also very tentatively suggest that postdisciplinarity might contribute in some ways to decolonization. I think that's potentially true in that thinking beyond disciplines after they've been established, particularly in the Western and by extension colonial university, allows for the possibility of other knowledges and ways of thinking to be addressed, and for reflection on the impacts of disciplinarity, university, and wider Western hegemony on exactly the kinds of injustices that we might be interested in looking at and hoping to address in some way in transitional justice or transformative justice. I'm partly tentative about this because I think the idea of decolonization only as ways of thinking is obviously limited, and I think it's Kojo Karam has said in his recent book that decolonization is an event, thing that happened or is happening in some ways, rather than only being about thinking a bit differently, and also being a Western-based global North white scholar saying, I've got this idea that decolonizes things, maybe is also already intertwined with not being fully kind of decolonized world. But I do think it could have a role in pushing scholars and by extension practitioners to think beyond assumptions that have been established by disciplines which are saying in a Foucauldian sense are disciplined as well, that are shaping what can and cannot be done and should not be done, and each of these things could be questioned and ought to be questioned, and that questioning can then extend out of the seminar room and into practice, at least potentially.
Yeah, I would agree, Matt, that there's a need to think differently. As much as transitional justice is relatively young as a field, if we're calling it a field, you do still see the same sort of problems are being discussed over quite a long period of time, and I think there is a need to look to different tools, and I think the notion of postdisciplinary is really helpful in that regard. I'll bring this episode to a close as I'm aware of time, and thank you for doing such a good job of articulating these big ideas in the space of about 20 minutes. But yeah, thank you for joining us, Matt. I'll put relevant links in the show notes so that our listeners can follow up on the relevant publications that you've mentioned. And yeah, thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.